you, Fabricana. Halloween's a time of year where we may find ourselves with a lot of creative ideas, but not a lot of time. In this series of videos, we will show you how to create 3 custom accent pieces with little to no sewing for a unique costume look. So here's the simple superhero-inspired cape that we're going to be making today. So we'll be talking about the types of fabrics to use for this type of cape. We're going to talk about the technique to cut the perfect half circle, and finally we're going to show how to sew the double fold bias tape onto the neck edge, which also becomes the tie for the cape. So let's get started. So let's talk about the fabric that we're going to use to make the cape. Because this project is going to have very little sewing involved, we want to get a fabric that when it's cut, it doesn't unravel, so we don't actually have to sew the edge. And if you're wondering how much fabric you're going to need, you take the width of your fabric, this one is 60 inches wide, and you buy half that much worth of length. So we've cut 30 inches of length for this fabric. If you're working with a fabric that's only 45 inches wide, you'll need 22.5 inches. Of course, that cape will be a little bit shorter. So now that we've removed the selvages, we pretty much have a rectangle that's twice as long as it is wide. Now we want to turn this into a perfect half circle. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to fold our piece of fabric in half, bringing the corners together to pretty much create what should be close to a perfect square. The way we're going to mark our quarter circle is we're going to line up the end of our measuring tape with one of the edges, one of the corners that's along the fold. And we're going to look at the width of the fabric, which for me is about 74 centimeters, using metric here in Canada. I'm going to place a pin at that point. The next thing I'm going to do is slightly pivot, leaving the measuring tape at the corner. I'm going to pivot the tape, and again I'm going to put another pin in at that 74 centimeter point. I'm going through both layers. I'm going to continue to do this pivot and pin procedure, and you can see that it's starting to form an arc, which will be the quarter circle. When we open up the fabric, will become our half circle cape. The next thing we want to do is mark the neckline. Now, starting from the same corner that we were pivoting from, we're going to use a measurement of 12 centimeters to mark the neckline. If you want a larger opening, you might want to go a little bit bigger, and if it's for a child, you might want to go a little bit smaller. So following the same procedure, and maybe putting the pins a little bit closer because it's kind of a tighter curve here, we're going to put in a bunch of pins at the 12 centimeter mark, and that's going to become our cutting line for the neck line. So here we finished our cutting. I'm going to open up our big half circle. You can see it's starting to look more like our superhero cape. The last thing that we need to do is put our double fold bias tape along the neck edge, which will also become our ties. And we've chosen a nice metallic double fold bias tape that will have that nice superhero theme to it. And we've cut about 1.25 meters, which is about 48 inches. If you find it's a little bit generous for the size you're doing, you can always cut it down later. As we mentioned in our previous double fold bias tape videos, one side of the bias tape will always be slightly narrower than the other. It's that side that we want to stitch on to the right side of our fabric. When we open it up, we're going to line that raw edge to the raw edge of the fabric and stitch in that crease on the narrower side of the bias tape. So here we've finished sewing the double fold bias tape on the neck edge. If you're worried about the ends fraying, you can always turn it a couple of times and stitch through to keep the ends from fraying. So here's our cape finished with very little sewing. She's starting to look more like a superhero. Tune in next time for our no-sew tutu.